Good morning from Boston. Good afternoon from UK. Good evening from India. Welcome everyone. And thank you for joining us today to break down and discuss the economic impact of art, design, and architectural events happening around the world. Festivals, design weeks, biennales, triennales, virtual and physical initiatives have all gained immense importance and for sure play a critical role in the contribution to the global creative economy. Today, we will talk about the importance of quantifying and qualifying this impact and how best it's done. Thank you, Boston Design Week, for giving us this forum to discuss this critical and extremely important subject. Let me introduce myself. I'm Amit Gupta, founder and editor-in-chief of STIRworld. I founded STIR, an acronym for See, Think, Inspire, Reflect, to be a global entity that offers carefully curated content in the domain of art, architecture, and design. We launched STIRworld.com in 2019, which is now a globally recognized digital publication. And more recently, we launched STIRpad.com in 2021, a platform that connects industry creative professionals and allied entities. Joining me today is Andrew Graves, Director of Ortus Economic Research. Andrew is an economic research consultant and a project director. He has 28 years of experience in the field of economic development, helping clients to design, evaluate, and assess the impact of policies, strategies, and interventions designed to deliver growth. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be with you this afternoon.
Why is knowing the economic impact of design weeks and festivals important? Design weeks and art festivals are being increasingly challenged to justify government funding, corporate sponsorship, and other support by demonstrating the larger economic impact. And that's a subject which is very important for all of us in the creative community globally to ponder upon, and there is a need to understand why this is important for the growing creative economy globally. Before we begin, a few housekeeping requests. Andrew and I will engage in a dialogue during which you are free to put your questions or thoughts down in the chat box. After we complete a conversation, we will take a few questions depending on how much time we left with. Over to you, Andrew. Request you to please say a few words about you and Ortus before we deep dive into the subject.
Thank you. So I've been working in economic development and related research for 28 years. Until 2017, I ran a medium-sized economic consultancy called Trends Business Research. And since 2017, I've been a director of Ortus Economic Research here in the UK. We have worked extensively both in the fields of economic impact assessment, but also within the creative industries. So my involvement in research in the creative industry started about 15 years ago. And we've only really been looking at it in the UK for 20 years. But 15 years ago, I started to work with various agencies, including government, to understand the economic importance of the creative industries to the UK. And since then, we've delivered numerous studies for all the major organisations in the UK, looking at different aspects of creativity, including quite a lot of work for the Design Council. And this is where my interest in design specifically has derived. In 2015, we helped them design a new methodology for understanding the economic importance and value of design. And this was wrapped up in a study called the Design Economy. We've since been doing work with them on design skills, the link between design and innovation, and so on and so forth. And through that, we've developed a number of relationships with design festivals around the world, the latest of which is Boston. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon to take part in the Boston Design Week. One of the the major topic for this afternoon is the impact of design festivals, but I think we're going to touch on the importance of design as an economic driver as well.
Correct. That you preempted the question, Andrew, which we want to discuss. Why conduct an economic impact study? I mean, what is the need and why do we need to conduct an economic impact study for design festivals and design weeks such as Boston Design Week?
Yeah, I think there are a number of reasons why that's a good thing to do. Firstly, I think that it's important to understand, really, I think that a festival, an event, delivers more than just a benefit to the people that take part in it, whether that be the audience who come or the sponsors or the companies engaged with it or the locations that are visited and so on and so forth. So there's that wider impact of events, which I think is little understood and, is worthy of some discussion and understanding. For a festival, clearly you have the organisers of the festival who are interested in running a successful event. You have an audience which attends to, gain insight, gather information, have an experience. And you have sponsors who are seeking to raise their brand awareness, communicate their messages, and so on and so forth. And then, you've got service providers who might be hosting visitors in their hotels or restaurants and so on. So, we kind of understand, I think, how a festival creates, in principle at least, value. But actually, there are other indirect benefits, as we would call them, that I think are less discussed and less understood. In particular, I think with respect to design, I'm thinking about connections that might be made at a design festival between designers or potential service providers and clients. I'm talking about a stimulus that might be provided for the city in which a festival is hosted. That might be raising the profile of that city. It might be raising the profile of design as a career, as a pathway that people can go into. It might be heightening the understanding of the link between design and economic growth or innovation and other levers which are important to economic growth. So there's another sort of, I think, layer of impacts which are really important, and in my opinion, important to understand and to articulate the value of. So I think design festivals have got the opportunity really to not just stimulate economic growth, but also to understand how that's happening and to articulate those messages. So I think really for organisers, the direct answer to your question, I think, is 3 reasons. For organisers, they might be interested in understanding the impact of the festival so that they can influence their own future planning. What went well, what didn't work so well, how do we increase our impact in the areas of interest? Or it might also be because they want to influence stakeholders. That might be sponsors, that might be public funders, it might be policy teams, it might be other stakeholders that the festival wishes to influence because of the greater good, because of that sort of altruistic desire to develop design in their location. And of course, there might be a very practical reason, and this happens a lot in the UK certainly, which is that there's public money invested in an event. The investment of that money requires an impact assessment to be undertaken. So I think there's a host of reasons really.
So there are various levels economic impact can be measured on. There's community level, there's city level, and a country level. So what kind of economic impact studies do you recommend to measure the impact at various levels?
Well, I think there are 2 main kinds of study in this field. One is an impact assessment of a festival itself. And within a study like that, you have to consider the spatial distribution, if you like, and sort of dissipation of those impacts. Particularly if, and again, based on sort of UK and other experience, particularly if funding comes from an organisation which has a particular spatial focus. So, for example, using Boston as an example, if there were public money invested by Boston, then they would want to understand the impact for Boston within the sort of wider and total impacts of the festival. So that those aspects, those parameters sometimes need to be taken into account of when you're delivering the impact assessment itself. But I think the other type of study, and I've sort of touched on this already, that can be done is of the wider design economy in a place, and understanding, the jobs, the levels of productivity, the growth rates, the wealth created by that, and also the levers, the externalities, the spin outs that come from having a strong design economy in a particular location. And that could be, for example, not just the link between design and innovation, which is important, but also if we think about where the world of work is heading over the next 30 years, some jobs are going to be increasingly influenced by automation, but some jobs are more ripe, if you like, to be automated than others, and design is certainly a skill, a competency which is at the other end of that continuum. So there's a sustainability point, I think, about design as a discipline within a local economy, and how important that is for sustainability.
So what is the information which you're seeking from these studies which are relevant for the impact measurement? We know Guggenheim happened in Bilbao and the city transformed, and various large-scale festivals happen. For example, Burning Man happens, and there's a huge amount of influx from hospitality sector to F&B to travel. At the same time, on community level, the creative economy changes and the dynamics of creative economy changes. Now, when we look at design weeks and festivals, which are city-specific or sometimes country-specific, what is the information which your studies seek and look for, which can be then further interpreted and can be put together as evidence and presented to the various stakeholders involved in that design week?
Well, I think there's a huge variety within that. So what's key here, I think, as with any research study, is for there to be a clear understanding from the beginning as to what the objectives of the study are. We've already talked a little bit about the various reasons why a study like this might be done, and in large part that's driven by the needs of the audience. So if it's an internal study for the people who lead and govern a design week, then that might suggest a certain set of objectives and a certain range of data to collect and so on and so forth. But if the objective is to influence policymakers or to tell public funders how well their money has been spent and invested, then the objectives might be slightly different. So it's important that at the start of a study like this, those aims and objectives and key research questions are set out. And there are a number of tools that are used in this sort of work to help structure studies. And I just want to talk about one of them now, because this is a key part of impact assessment, and it really provides a framework for the design of a study, whether it be relatively simple or really sophisticated. This still holds, and the tool is called a logic model. Some of you may be familiar with this idea, but the purpose of a logic model is to articulate and lay out a relationship between what goes into a project or an initiative, a design festival in this case, and what we are expecting, either directly anticipating or maybe there might be unanticipated or unintended impacts and benefits as well. But this logic model sets these out in the form of, and in my example here, I hope you can all see, we're working from left to right here. The inputs to a project could be sponsorship money, investment by the organizer, obviously time and effort, expertise and know-how, and often locations and assets. What are the things that go into this festival, this project, to make it work? And then we start to try and map out, firstly, outputs. So these are very sort of basic things that we expect to happen as a result of, for example, holding an event. So you hold an event, you expect and you hope people will attend it. So outputs can be very quantitative things like how many people have attended, how many events have we staged, how big were those events, over what timetable, how many repeat visitors are we getting, are we drawing audiences from different areas like government, like potential sponsors, like from the public. Are we delivering networking events where we're hoping that some of the, this sort of, some of the more commercial relationships might be built, and so on and so forth. And then there might be qualitative aspects as well, like understanding, that there's been a high quality experience, high quality information or insight gained by the participants in the events, and so on and so forth. So they're very sort of immediate things, but then the real sort of the real impact, I guess, is assessed through the next three columns, and these are slightly longer term and a bit more challenging, I guess, to generate evidence for. So key outcomes from a design festival will be visitors attending the location of that festival, expenditure from those visitors, positive festival experience, perceived value for money that the visitors and attendees to the festival would report, interest in design festivals, intent, and so I'm just providing some examples here of the sorts of short-term outcomes that can be delivered by a festival. And then we're looking perhaps more longer term, increased demand for design education. Are young people coming to design festivals having their brains switched on to the idea of design as a career and going on to choose design education as a result? Is there increased investment in a city because it's been highlighted as an attractive place for certain companies to come and invest, to set up new branches of their operation, and so on and so forth? And I've set out a few others there. Labour market impacts. Are we attracting better talent to Boston because the festival is acting as a hub for that? And then I've listed out a few potential impacts. Return on investment for the funders, for the festival organisers, and so on, for the sponsors. Whether there's a demonstrable growth in the design economy or in the businesses that the design festival is most relevant to. Is it improving business performance? Is it improving wealth distribution? Are there any social impacts? Is it leading to a different use of design within a place to solve social and other challenges, transportation, for example? Is it driving more innovation? Is it improving quality of life? So the purpose of putting this up in front of us today is just to give an example of how you would develop a logic model which articulates your starting point, the initiative that you're implementing, and the things that go into that, and the anticipated and unanticipated outcomes and impacts that might arise. And this is really important because, as I said earlier on, it becomes the framework for the research that you put in place to gather the quantitative and qualitative evidence that is going to inform your impact assessment. Okay. Now, naturally, and again, I'm sure everyone's aware of this, a big part of festival impact will be the attraction of visitors to a place and the spend that is associated with that, the overnights, the hotels and the restaurants and so on and so forth. One of the things that research tells us is that because there's a lot of work, certainly in the UK and I'm sure in other places, about the economic impact of tourism. But what we know about convention attendees, if you like, so that's akin, I guess, to design festival type activities, is that actually they spend more on average than your typical tourist visitor. So, factors like that need to be taken into account, particularly if the study is designed to be quite sort of modest and small, and it's therefore having to draw on other secondary data, pre-existing studies and so on and so forth for some of its assumptions. So, to summarize, I think the answer to the question is it depends on the objective of the study. It depends on the audience, and it depends on what types of impacts the study is designed to demonstrate.
Great. So that I'm sure there are a lot of studies available, studies done when there's a larger scale festival where we have Edinburgh Festival, for example, which is a yearly, and the whole city comes alive, and there's world, lands there, and there's a huge economic impact. I'm sure there's studies available there, or many biennales like Venice Architectural Biennale and so on and so forth. Do we have information already existing in a public domain where smaller events and smaller design weeks and festivals create and how do we have an access to that information?
This is quite challenging because the sorts of studies you've referred to there's an economic impact study of the London Design Festival, for example. These are bespoke exercises and therefore relatively involved and therefore quite costly. And what they do is they establish a methodology for gathering new primary data, which is where a lot of the cost goes from, for example, attendees at these festivals in relation to the money they've spent, their intentions in terms of coming back the next year and so on and so forth. So that's often a key part of a study like this. But I think that there are sources of data that can be used to develop an understanding of impact, which don't necessarily require that. Now, of course, you get better data and you get a more accurate assessment if you go down the route of gathering primary data. But an example would be, looking back at the logic model, the first part, if you recall, was inputs and outputs. Now, the organizer of a design festival should be reasonably well placed to be able to assess and understand what those inputs and what those immediate outputs have been. So the number of people attending events, the number of events, and so on and so forth. Whether festival organisers programmatically do this sort of analysis, I don't know. But certainly the data you would think would be collected because of it comes through the marketing and selling processes. There's also, as I said earlier on, quite a lot of data often about tourism. Tourism in particular places as well in the UK. Lots of locations around the country commission their own studies about the economic impact of tourism, within which you will find data about things like typical length of overnight stay, split by business visitor versus leisure visitor, expenditure, and so on and so forth. And therefore, I would suggest that it is possible to employ data held by a design festival organizer, along with some of that tourism data within the location or a similar location to where the festival is being held, to develop some fairly kind of quick and easy estimates of the visitor impact of a festival. Now, I think there's a wide range of other impacts which is really important to recognise, but in terms of calling on existing data, I think it's hard to imagine how you can go much beyond that, what I've just described, without actually generating new primary data from, for example, festival attendees, from sponsors, from other stakeholders to inform the assessment.
So bringing inputs and outputs for the quantitative data, when you do quantitative research, could be much easier because then you would have a sample and you would have various, your logic model that you talked about, and one can do a comprehensive study on quantitative research. But what is the methodology you adopt when you have to do a qualitative impact, when you have to research the qualitative impact of these festivals?
Yeah, the fundamental methodology is based around consultation and discussion. So that could be through formal mechanisms like a survey, which is targeted at a stratified sample of festival attendees. It could be electronic. It could be on paper filled in during attendance. It could be one-to-one discussions. It could be being in a hall with, an exhibition hall and speaking to people as they're attending the events, as they're attending the festival, asking them for qualitative, evidence, qualitative data about their experience. And it is really important, actually, to, where possible, to try and gather qualitative evidence alongside quantitative for a couple of reasons. One is the qualitative evidence often explains the quantitative stuff. So you can investigate kind of why a particular pattern is emerging in the quantitative data. Why is the value of our festival X when we maybe thought it was Y? So you can investigate those issues, but you can also explore through the evidence gathering ways in which the experience and therefore the potential impact of a festival could be improved in the future. So there's you can gather evidence to inform recommendations, decisions that can be taken after the festival to improve its impact or to improve its outcomes for its sponsors or for any other stakeholder. But the fundamental methodology is interviews, potentially surveys, discussions, sometimes workshops and focus groups, particularly targeted at groups of stakeholders. So if there's a public policy side, then often it's quite useful and easy to get policymakers in a room, or these days at an event on Teams or something similar, to discuss the impact of the event as they see it. Or you can hold those things in person. But for attendees, I would say it's discussion. And one of the things you've got to be a bit careful about is just taking up too much of their time, because obviously they're there to enjoy the festival rather than to speak to impact assessors like me. But it can be done. But it's that feedback from attendees and stakeholders is crucial.
So there is a time gap between data collection and then resource implementation or implementing the knowledge which we've collected from the data. What happens in between stages, and how long does it take normally from data collection to resource implementation?
I think the main thing that happens between is, in some ways, the kind of clever and important bit, which is that the data and evidence is collated, analysed, but most importantly, it's considered, it's assimilated. And of course, we come back at this point to the purpose of the study, the research questions, and so on and so forth. So assuming the study has been done well and professionally, at this point, you have got the evidence and data that relate to your research questions. The exercise then is to sit down and consider what that evidence means in terms of the impact of the festival, in terms of the audience that you're trying to communicate that message to, and also what it might mean in terms of decisions and recommendations moving forward. So part of it is about, we all know the phrase, rubbish in, rubbish out. So you've got to get the data collection right. You've got to do it professionally. You've got to do it robustly. But if that is then not interpreted and assessed appropriately, then often you're left with an impact study which hasn't really got any a great deal of value. So I would say that the key stage in that gap, as you described it, is assimilation and interpretation. And you don't need to be you don't necessarily need to be an impact assessment professional or someone who's experienced in doing it. You actually need to be, I think, a bit more experienced on the festival side. So, what does this actually mean? How do we use this evidence, which tells us something about impact, to inform our strategies moving forward, or to influence policymakers to invest in our festival or design? Or how do we use it to influence another group of stakeholders, sponsors, for example, to invest in this new idea that we've got for increasing our impact? So really it comes down, I think, to interpretation and assimilation.
Would love to hear any case studies or any examples where you've been managed to collect data, both quantitative and qualitative, from a certain design festival or design week, and then in what format you end up presenting it to the authorities or the stakeholders of the city or the country or the community, and what was the outcome?
Yeah, in terms of outputs, I mean, we're certainly in the UK, we're still quite a sort of traditional industry in the sense that our clients often require pretty standard kind of research reports, which set out the evidence, which draw conclusions, but which also often highlight recommendations for policy development or improvement in the festival design, and so on. But again, I think that very much depends on who the audience is. If it's an internal audience, the people who are managing and running the festival, and if the purpose is for assessing how perhaps changes to the festival program or over time are having an influence on the benefits that the festival is delivering, then it may be a much more concise and pithy, maybe even a presentation which contains the key evidence. We find that infographics can be very powerful in communicating evidence around impact. We find that PowerPoint presentations, which are visually arresting rather than very wordy, can be very powerful. And many of our clients, I think, are now much more receptive to that sort of visual presentation approach.
So data analysis has become a key thing today, and there's a huge amount of artificial intelligence has come in, and the intervention of AI has come in evaluating the data. Is there a software or a tool which Ortus is looking for to develop soon?
I think there is a toolkit that could be designed. We haven't done it yet. I mean, maybe we will. But I think there is a toolkit that could be designed to help guide design festivals and other festivals in delivering an impact assessment. I mean, we talked a little bit about logic model earlier on. Yep. Again, I mean, it's very straightforward tool but a crucial part, really, of, if you like, the thinking that goes into an impact assessment. The other formal tool that we often use is something called an evaluation framework, which flows out of the logic model. What that does is it identifies particular measures and indicators and methodologies for collecting them, which align to the outputs and outcomes and impacts that the logic model has identified. So I think there are toolkits that could be developed. One of the things I did have when we were talking about this discussion was actually, I wonder whether there's an opportunity for design festivals themselves to start sharing information and evidence about the impacts that their festivals are having. I talked earlier on about, and you asked me about existing data that might be available to support these sorts of exercises, and it is quite challenging. But if there were some sort of sharing platform for impact evidence, where benchmarks could be shared, for example, average length of stay of an attendee at the festival, average daily expenditure, etc. Some of these indicators could be compiled and shared to allow festivals to overcome. I mean, it is, there is a significant barrier here, which is funding of an impact assessment. If that's going to be done outside of the festival team, then a budget will need to be identified. But actually, through tools and through the sharing of information, it could be possible for festivals to actually take these exercises on themselves and start to develop their own evidence about impact based on their internal data, and these tools and benchmarks that could be shared.
Great. That was a great insight, Andrew. And I hope all the design weeks and festivals do employ this study and study models because it's critical. It is critical in these days when do we all know creative economy is the economy to look after, and creative economy is the economy to go after in times to come. We all know that they have started contributing over 5 to 6% to the country's GDP when it comes to USA or even in UK. And these studies like this are very, very important. And this also is critical simply because we would have enough and more sponsors or government funding backing us if we can back our case study with a strong, powerful quantitative and qualitative data. We have a question from Daria. Thank you, Daria, for coming in. What is the most important goal of design events communicating with non-designer audience? And what is the non-designer audience expectation from such experience? And is there any, just to add a layer to Daria's question, and is there any way to gauge that or measure that?
Yeah, this is an interesting question because and it touches on something which I think is becoming more and more important, which is, first of all, that we understand that creativity and design as a subset within that is not just done by the creative industries. You know, it's not in some kind of silo within art or music or film or TV or advertising. Creativity is much more prevalent and pervasive across our world and our economy than that. And exactly the same can be said about design. But I think non-design people, the non-design audience you're talking about there, don't understand that in the way that I think they should, because of the wider benefit that design skills, design competencies, design approaches have to our economy. So to give a specific example, when we designed the design economy study back in 2014, 2015, one of the specific objectives was to try and widen the understanding of design as a discipline that happens outside of design consultancies and architecture and the industries, the vertical industries that are aligned with design. And what we found when we examined where people in design jobs were being employed was that actually every industry in the UK certainly employed designers of one sort or another. Now, they're much more intensively employed in some places, for example, design consultancies, and perhaps less so in manufacturing environments, for example. But that doesn't mean that that their input is any less valuable. In fact, in manufacturing engineering, it's absolutely fundamental. So first of all, understanding that is the case, and understanding that it's design that drives economic value in those other industries is fundamental to switching on, I think, the ideas and the imagination of non-design audiences as to how important design as a discipline, as an approach, is, well beyond the aesthetic aspect of it, of course. So I think it's important to get these messages out there so that policymakers and other people who've got a stake in creativity and design, even if they don't actually realize it, are being alive, or becoming alive to the opportunities. In terms of the second half of the question, the non-design audience's expectation, I think that's harder. But when it comes, I think, to articulating what the value of design is, what the value of a design festival is, I think this comes back to the point about audience earlier on. Those messages are going to fall on deaf ears unless they push the buttons of the non-design audience. So if you're talking about, I don't know, a city planner who's got a transportation problem, then if they understand that actually within the city that they're operating in, there's a very well-developed and specialized design economy that's actually able to provide the skills to solve those problems, then they can start to look locally for support in solving their problem. But unless you know that's the problem, or, just an example, but unless you know that's the problem, it's hard to target the message. So I think it's important for people who are interested in promoting design, whether it be a festival or the wider benefit of it, to pick up those messages, to identify those buttons and levers, and to curate, if you like, the evidence about design to target them.
And to add to that, design as a whole contributes a lot to every being on the planet Earth. I mean, there's a huge contribution of design in our lifestyle, in our living standards, in the way we think and work and talk. Design festivals and design weeks, and the impact of that from the design community can percolate down to the common man, or to the audience which may not be a design professional. That linkages can be established from the scale of operation we are working on weeks and festivals. There's the next question from Chappie Vic. Thank you, Chappie. In case such as COVID, how do you think the lack of travel will affect the impact of design festivals, and how it might change?
Yeah, this is a really interesting and obviously very pertinent question, given where we are now. Yeah. I mean, I think in the short term it may have a significant impact, because I think a lot of the impact of a festival, whether it be design or anything else, comes from people traveling to attend events and to spend money in that location that they otherwise wouldn't spend. That is just a fact, I guess. So obviously some of that won't have happened in the last 18 months, and it may take time, and we may never, I guess, recover to the same level, but it certainly will take time for that to recover. There are other impacts which I think are, or other mechanisms by which impact are created, which I think may also be certainly in the short term negatively impacted. So obviously, if people attend a festival and there is a sort of convention aspect to it, or a networking aspect to it, or whatever, then those potential commercial linkages may not happen in quite the same way if that event is held remotely. It's quite difficult, I think, to recreate that in-person experience. So I mean, we could talk, I think, at some length about this, but I think it's quite clear that in the short term the impacts will be significantly diminished. But that doesn't mean there's no value, obviously. But in terms of making these arguments, I think it's a matter of maybe influencing the logic model, thinking about the way in which these interactions are happening and how the value might spin out of that in different ways, and adjusting research methodologies accordingly.
Yes, and in terms of content creation, in terms of collaboration and building a community, of a design community to disseminate information and knowledge, there could be various other modes and mediums which we all have, which we all are gradually adapting to. But yes, in a short term, it will for sure affect the allied economy, which is travel industry and hospitality industry and other allied industries which are locally impacted. And we hope that changes soon, and we learn to fight with this. We have a next question from FLT Art and Design Week. The cost of commissioning these studies and surveys, with a comment that World Design Week Forum should collect this data for sure. I think this collection of data is extremely important. I'll leave it to you and Riru answer on the cost of commissioning these studies.
Yeah, I mean, the direct answer is it depends. But to give you a kind of feel for it, I guess, something as significant as the economic impact assessment of the London Design Festival, London Design Week, I would think would cost something like £50,000, because it's very involved in terms of the methodology that's been employed. It's also limited. I mean, there's definitely more you could do. I don't think, it doesn't explore these sort of commercial spillovers, externalities, and so on and so forth, which I think are really important. But, that could be up to £50,000. We don't need to spend that much money, because actually a lot of the exercise can be done by the design festival team, perhaps with some guidance from somebody with some expertise in designing and delivering these studies. So you could spend a relatively small amount of money acquiring that advice, provided you've got the resource to run through, employ the tools, execute a visit, an attendee survey, for example, collect that data together, run some simple analysis, draw in data from other places to inform your analysis and your assimilation of the evidence, run some workshops, or just go around talking to people, gathering qualitative evidence about their experience and what they're intending to do, whether they've made any of these connections, whether they've had their kind of career path influenced by, et cetera, et cetera. So, you could spend, I think, a relatively small amount of money, provided there's some resource internally to actually do the sort of mechanics of it.
Great. I can see Tony typing in. We put a question, and there is a question. Over the course of your career, what are the same markers you have noticed of economic shifts? That's a question from Nitija.
I'm not quite sure how to interpret that, but let me try. I mean, what's interesting, I think, is that actually, in terms of the way that events like festivals deliver impact, I don't think there have been many shifts. I think actually that, the content of festivals will have shifted over time, and therefore the subtleties of the range of impacts and how those impacts are delivered have changed. But, going back to the very first sort of event type exercise that I did, I think we were looking for the same kinds of things, and we were looking for them in the same kinds of ways. What I think has happened, though, is that there is a difference, I think, around the way that design now delivers impact. I think that it's, design is, again, I don't need to tell you any of this, but it's increasingly digital. It's increasingly all-pervasive. It is increasingly identified and understood, I think, although there's a lot of work to do on that. So I think that the extent and the kind of scale of the impact has changed, but the way in which it changes, certainly through the sort of, if you like, the festival model, is not that much different.
Great. There's one more question from Tony. How do I measure the size of design community in my city, and what resources might exist?
Okay, this is an interesting one. Now, because it will depend on where you are, actually, and the reason it depends on where you are is because different administrations, different governments, have different approaches to collecting data about businesses and the people they employ and the skills and occupations involved and so on and so forth. So, for example, in the UK, we have something called the Office of National Statistics, which is our kind of main sort of Bureau of Statistics, the equivalent of that. They collect data on all sorts of things and make quite a lot of that available publicly, which means that if you wanted to do an assessment of, for example, the number of firms, the amount of employment in a particular place, in a particular industry, you can do it. What you can't do in the UK very easily, just through public sources, is the more sophisticated design economy style work, where you're actually looking at occupations within industries as well. You need a different level of access to data. But as I understand it, in the US, the statistics available are much more sophisticated, actually. I mean, you have a census of employment, I think, which every business in the US has to. by law contribute to, which means that actually I think you've got a richer data set, and that allows you, I think, to access those data to understand, some fairly broad brush, but also on the prevalence of design in a place. More than happy to sort of share some more detailed thoughts on that kind of stuff, because we've done some of that work in Atlanta.
Great. Thank you. I think this was insightful, and I hope audience enjoyed listening to you. And I'm sure they had a great takeaway from the fact that these studies are extremely important and critical on any scale, at any level, micro or macro, because the more we can present it to the stakeholders of creative economy, and the more we can structure it, the better it is going to be for many patronage, corporate sponsorships, and government funding to come in. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And I hope you follow Boston Design Week. There's a detailed program up on the website. Please don't miss it. Follow Boston Design Week, follow STIRworld.com, and any inputs from all of you would be great. I have a positive comment from FLT, which says, thank you. Would you like to come to Fort Lauderdale, Florida to present to our city commission? They don't support us monetarily, but like to reap the benefits of our design weeks and festival. That's FLT Art and Design Week for you, Andrew.
Please get in touch via our website, or perhaps Tony could put us in touch.
Thank you all. Follow Boston Design Week, follow STIRworld. Thanks for coming in, and it's been a pleasure to have you over. And thank you, Andrew, for being so kind and patient to come on Boston Design Week Forum with STIRworld.com. Good night.
Thank you, Amit.
Everybody.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.